My name is Shelley Stewart III. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company, and among several things, I lead our Institute for Black Economic Mobility. I am also a proud alumnus of the INROADS program. I have the privilege of discussing work my firm has been doing on the racial wealth gap and creating communities of action. Thank you in advance for your time and attention. We will cover three things today. The first is how current events may exacerbate the racial wealth gap. The second, we'll take a look at the historical context covering efforts towards accelerating Black economic mobility. And lastly, we'll look forward and talk about evolving into a community of action. To set the context, my colleagues and I have done some work to try to assess the economic cost of the racial wealth gap today in the US. We found that by 2028, the US will be foregoing $1 to $1.5 trillion of GDP due to this wealth inequity. That translates to around $11,000 to $12,000 of GDP per capita. This is a large sum of economic output that would benefit the whole economy, particularly in a moment like the one we're in right now. In thinking about how do we address the wealth gap, we thought it necessary to get pretty granular to understand the barriers and sources of the wealth gap. We broke it into four stages. The first is community context. These are the public assets and institutional arrangements that are embedded within place where we live. These are things like educational systems and the quality of public services. And it's been well documented that there are lots of inequality that exists in these things. The second is family wealth. This is about private assets and business development. So home ownership, business ownership, real drivers of wealth. And again, we know that historically there's been significant barriers along a number of these areas. Third is family income. That's actually where INROADS specifically plays, as well as in earlier parts of the journey. This is all about human development and employability, educational attainment, professional advancement, and income inequality. And these are also areas where we have tremendous opportunity for improvement. Lastly is family savings. This is about resource management and wealth building. How do we take that income we earn over a lifetime, translate it into wealth, and most importantly, lower economic volatility over time? There is no doubt that the upheavals that are going on in 2020 have disproportionately impacted the Black community. It's been widely reported. If we layer it into our wealth stages, there are a few things I'd cite. In the community context, we know that 13% of the population is Black. However, 22% of COVID deaths are Black, and this has a lot to do with place and the resources or lack thereof in certain communities. On the family wealth side, we know that Black and other minority businesses are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 disruption due to the sectors that many of these businesses operate in, disproportionately impacted. Family income, 40% of Black jobs are at risk in 2020. Jobs are at risk for all Americans. Black Americans in particular have a higher percentage of at-risk jobs. And lastly, family savings, this ability to weather economic volatility. Black families on average have only 5 days of income saved, making it incredibly difficult to deal with furloughs and layoffs and prolonged unemployment. If we go back to the inequities and what it means for the health outcomes, we find that there is this disproportionately high risk of severe illness and death from COVID-19. And there are a number of factors: socioeconomic, clinical health, quality of care, and experience. And we really looked at a set of indicators that would help us to understand were certain groups more vulnerable. And if you look at the factors that increase vulnerability, severe housing issues, unemployment, incarceration rate, poverty levels, food insecurity, neighborhood stress, Black Americans over-indexed on all of these different indicators, suggesting substantially higher risk of death and severe illness from this virus. So in addition to the neighborhood conditions where folks live, increasing the vulnerability, there are some other factors that are worth mentioning. One is the increased risk of exposure. Overall, 20% of workers in low-wage, high-contact essential jobs are Black. The top three being psychiatric aides, orderlies, and nursing assistants. Many of these folks remain on the front lines of this crisis in jobs that are low-wage, have high contact, and therefore high risk of exposure to the virus. We also have seen, from a testing perspective, that there are some inequities that are emerging. For example, Black Americans were more likely to try to get tested for the COVID-19 virus, but had a significantly lower success rate. And we know also, and it's been widely covered, that the comorbid conditions are significantly higher in the Black community, stemming from some of the socioeconomic issues that we've discussed. In fact, Black Americans have a 30% higher likelihood of having a chronic condition that will exacerbate the impacts of COVID-19. The other issue that we're discussing as a society is the disproportionate outcomes of the criminal justice system. We know that these interactions with the criminal justice system have damaging effects on employment, child custody, finances. Today, 40% of the US correctional population is Black, despite being only 13% of the population. We know that Black men get 1.2 times the sentence on average when compared to white men when convicted of the same crime. And that Black women have 2 times the imprisonment rate of white women in the US. Again, all of these things have damaging implications for financial wherewithal. So coming back to crisis and thinking about COVID and how we might expect different groups to rebound and recover from this crisis, we can look to the financial crisis for some indication of what we might expect. In 2009 to 2011, from a recovery perspective, Black home equity grew at a significantly lower rate when compared to white home equity value, and shrunk significantly more from 2007 to 2009. So larger on the downswing, slower on the upswing. And this pattern holds true, and if anything, is more magnified for non-home equity wealth in the Black population. This is a call to action as we move towards hopefully what is near the end of this COVID-19 crisis, and activate to ensure that we have an even recovery that all groups participate in. I'm going to talk a little bit now about looking back over the rich history of people engaged in trying to address Black socioeconomic development. I won't hit everything here, but there's a celebrated history that goes back to the founding of many of our historically Black colleges and universities, many legacy civil rights organizations, NAACP, the Urban League, who are still in existence today and really pioneered the fight in many of these areas. Certainly the civil rights area, there's emergence of more organizations and civil rights groups to champion these causes. And then this wave in the 90s and the present, and I would say INROADS is a part of that, which was all about activating this landscape around economic empowerment and a number of things on the education side, on the financial resources side, affinity organizations in academia, whether it be the National Black MBA Association or NSBE, all organizations that have contributed so much to this cause. We're also seeing today the private sector get activated around racial equity. We've seen a tremendous outpouring from Fortune 500 companies making commitments on racial justice. 51% of the Fortune 500 companies made statements. 33% made concrete commitments. Over $6.8 billion have been contributed or committed rather to racial equity in the wake of George Floyd and a number of other events that we've recently experienced. We see compelling examples in the social, public, and private sector, targeting specific journeys, specific areas. INROADS is certainly one of the shining examples of this, as has been discussed and will continue to be discussed as part of this session. Creating opportunities to get talented minority youth into business early, preparing them for leadership role, and then supporting them throughout their development and networking early in their career journey. Self-help credit unions are a great example of getting financial access to products and services to underbanked, low-income, and minority individuals. There are lots of examples like this out there. And so the central point is the private sector is activated. There's a legacy of organizations focusing on this, and there are some shining examples in our time of organizations doing phenomenal work. With all that said, the racial wealth gap has still persisted for centuries. And in fact, it's stayed remarkably consistent over the last 30 years. And so the question then becomes, why? Why is it that the human impacts still exist and we can't close this gap? We know that you have only a 1 in 4 chance as a Black American of reaching the middle class. We know that the US economy is foregoing $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion by these wealth gaps persisting. There are organizations who are activated and who care. So why? And we set out to ask this question and try to answer it through a group of stakeholder discussions. In those discussions, we heard lots of different interesting things. And this is a word cloud that covers some of the things that we heard. Certainly there are institutional barriers, but no clear unifying agenda, lack of central coordination, high fragmentation, lack of data and accountability, inaccessible funding. A lot of different themes on this page, but the core theme that we pulled out, and you can see it in most of the things that are in the boldest and biggest font, is this lack of central coordination, a broad agenda that has clear objectives and accountability and reporting and transparency. And that brings us to this concept of community action. This concept of community action is all about tackling complex issues that require coalitions of stakeholders. These typically emerge in 3 archetypes. You've got interest groups that exchange ideas and thoughts on specific issues or programs in which they have common interest or passion. You've got practice groups where groups of individuals facilitate the learning and sharing of ideas to help find solutions over an extended period of time. And then you've got what I'd highlight as the action groups. These are groups that come together in a much more concrete and comprehensive way, aligned on a common goal, driving collective action, with regular convening and evaluation of progress against a shared agenda. Our research suggests that if we are to make significant progress on the wealth gap, on the income gap, on closing disparities with respect to healthcare, we need more formalized communities of action. These communities of action draw from all spheres of our economy and country: federal resources, foundations, Fortune 500, small businesses, think tanks, all coming together in this cohesive group with a core. And at this core is this idea of operating committee that helps to bring together a clear, unifying agenda. They agree on some mechanism to drive accountability and transparency. They align on what is working from taking an evidence-based approach. and where is it best for each of the different stakeholders to participate and contribute toward this common goal. In summary, to continue to make the progress that organizations like INROADS are making and even accelerate that progress, we need to build more communities of action where we prioritize areas for impact. Quality and employment and wages could be one. Align on individual and cross-organization actions across the priorities, and hold convening sessions to really advance these priorities. This community would jointly select metrics and accountability methods, would jointly align on governance and cadence, and would reconnect annually or even more frequently to share progress and best practices in a wider format. There are so many organizations from across the public, private, and social sector doing fantastic work. The opportunity is now, and the case is urgent given what we're seeing with the COVID-19 crisis and the social justice movement in this country, to come together in these more formalized communities to push forward on the critical issues that are before us. Again, I am Shelley Stewart III from McKinsey & Company. I want to send a heartfelt thank you to Forrest and the entire INROADS organization for inviting me to do this session. And I want to congratulate the organization for its transformational impact over 50 years. Thanks so much.